Well, I got a question from a commenter yesterday. The channel name was Discover the CTMU, and his question was, how does light travel? And he actually sent this in a video. So he basically said, here we have an eye, and here we have a photon, and this is and so how is information about the photon actually transmitted to the eye when there's no real good model for linear motion, either in standard physics, it's just assumed, but also in the CTMU where everything is conspansive, where it's just internally expanding and requantizing. So how is there that information about a state is actually communicated to the eye? And this is a very good question. I was actually wondering about this myself, and Chris Langen recently put out on his Substack a video about various passages in the Bible, and the first was Genesis 1:3, which says, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So, and he talked a lot about the kind of CTMU model of light, and actually specifically addressed this question of how does light travel if it's if it doesn't have any mass or anything else. So what he says essentially is that a light cone cross section encloses a potential which is then reactualized to the next state of the source or emitter. So the photon doesn't subsist on its own. Let's say this is a photon which is carrying information about a rock. So we can think. So the standard model would be, the rock is emitting photons, and that is receiving, and the eye is receiving that. And I'm going to say why I think that's a restriction, and then there's a metaphysical / conspansive dual to that. So but first we have to say what a photon is a quantum of light. So what is light? And that's really the key question, because it's not a physical object really. So light in Langen's model is a generalization of both information and telesis, and I'll say why that is. Or actually a restriction of telesis and a generalization of information. So light is a generalization of information because it's carrying information on the internal state of things. So this, enclosed within this photon, is information which can then be received by the eye, and I can identify this as a rock. So there's actually information enclosed in that. And if you think, if you look at the sun with the proper protective equipment, it's emitting rays of light which can then be received by me, and then I can perceive, okay, there's the sun, and 8 minutes later will be, or however long, that light will then go to Pluto, and it's the same information being communicated at different times. So what it's actually doing is that it carries the information by which, if perceived light, can regenerate and re-represent the object from which it emanated, if it's perceived by a sentient being, and then so it re-represents the instant from which it was emitted from one location in space and time. So this rock has some coordinate in space and time, or at least the information which the photon is carrying about the rock. So and in some ways the conspansive manifold, which is the CTMU model of the universe, is a generalization of light, because everywhere reality is communicating information about itself at the speed of light, because the speed of light is c, and that's actually invariant to the speed of information processing in the universe. Nothing can go faster than that, regardless of whether it has mass. But so reality is communicating information about itself at the speed of light to itself to make identifications and attributions about itself for its own purpose, to then self-model based on the information it receives. And the information is spatially and temporally invariant. You know, I could see a rock now. If I were 8 light years away, I'd see the rock in 8 years. But the information itself that's being carried in this photon is spatially and temporally invariant. So it carries information about a specific point in space and time, this rock at 11:11 a.m. But it's not identified or confined to that point. So it travels, and it doesn't travel in one direction, it travels in every direction at the same speed. So, and there are different photons communicating that information. And so it's doing this at the speed, so 1 year it will travel one light year. So it actually has a fixed speed, at least in a vacuum, and it's almost the same when it's traveling through air. So light is the way that telesis, which is the monic substrate of reality, so that's what reality is actually composed of, that reality exists and evolves through this medium called telesis, which is a generalization of energy to include information in metaphysical dynamics, and then the binding and unbinding of that as potential and actualization allows both for causation and the creation of the universe from its own generic ontic substance. So it's a self-restriction of potential. So telesis, everything in reality is telesis, and light is the way that it makes itself known to us. So I couldn't have any information about anything if I couldn't see anything, except for through my other senses. But so this is actually in some ways the ancient Greek model of perception said that the rock doesn't carry information to the eye, but the eye is actually emitting waves which then bounce off the rock, and then I can perceive that again. So the light is sending out these waves which then allow me to perceive whatever they send it to. So that makes intuitive sense because I can focus on a particular thing and see that. And in some ways, the CTMU almost revivifies this model because you are not just passively, there's light coming at you from every direction. You're not passively, seeing something. You're participating in the information you receive. So by perceiving something, you're actually contributing to its existence. This is one of the two axioms from which the CTMU is built up. It's cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, which is by Descartes, and Berkeley's, this is the one that's relevant, is SAS percepti, to be is to be perceived. So objects only really exist if they have secondary utility to secondary tellers, so humans, or the primary teller, who's God. So they exist in relation to those two. There's no thing in itself. There's no noumena, like Kant said. There's a thing in relation to God and in relation to humans. So I'm actually contributing to something's existence when I'm perceiving it. It's a bidirectional mapping. So, and light doesn't. So on that same note, light doesn't exist in the same way until it hits something, until it causes another event to actually happen. So if it's going in every direction, this rock, these light rays are just like going out into the ether. But once I perceive it, I'm actually giving substance to the rock and to the photon. That's actually information which is then absorbed and processed by reality and by us. So, and light, and to your point, so the question is, how does a photon travel? And this is a very prescient question, but it's something it's the wrong question because photons or light doesn't actually travel in space and time. And this is something Langen notes. He says that's a relic of the linear ectomorphic model, which says everything can be confined to just going on this line, and everything just moves from past to future, and there's no spiritual or mental. Everything is just physical and moves from past to future. But that's actually a restriction of the CTMU conspansive model, which says that there is that linear ectomorphic model. That's basically what science is describing. It's describing things outside of itself. But but that's coupled with an endomorphic model, which is actually communicating information about states. So photons are a property of the boundary of syntactic operators. Syntactic operators are particles. Everything is composed of syntactic operators that we can perceive. So whereby everything is communicating its internal state through the telic medium. So everything consists of syntactic operators and telesis, which then the syntactic operators are then almost clusters of telesis, and those states which end up at right angles to our line of perception, to the focus of our eyes, are recognized and processed and represented in the brain. So the light isn't traveling, everything else is traveling with respect to it. It's re-quantizing. And the interesting thing about that is that everything is, almost like pure light, and I'm saying that in a somewhat general way because what I'm actually talking about is telesis, which is a generalization of light to include the energy and matter concepts. But everything is pure light, this pure ontic substrate then representing itself, and a restriction of that potential, so telesis is pure potential, it can transform into anything, is what is occurring because objects are actually communicating their internal state to our eyes, allowing us to perceive matter, to perceive one thing instead of everything, and everything that we could possibly perceive. And there are a number of problems with the standard notion of linear travel, not just with respect to light, but with respect to everything, because it's kind of a paradoxical construct, and I'll explain why. Because it's a physical restriction, light and objects do travel, but it has a metaphysical / a conspansive dual where most of the processing and structure is going on. So I'll get into that if I do more, when I do more videos on the kind of CTMU physics, and especially classical physics, when we're talking about motion and matter, that these are really fundamental concepts, but I won't get into that right now. So thank you for to Discover the CTMU for your wonderful and insightful comments. This one actually, I didn't have the answer immediately, so I had to actually think and research about this. So thank you. Let the light shine forth in the darkness. May the peace of our Father in heaven be upon you. Like and subscribe. Peace.